And welcome to this month's Practice as Research seminar. I'm really excited to have with us Richard Longman, who's going to be talking to us today about sonic ways of knowing, researching life using sound. I'm particularly excited, as I've already said, because sound is obviously one of those creative methods that's often ignored and as a research practice, as an analytical tool. So having someone who's an expert in this space is really exciting on a very personal level as well. So Richard is a researcher, educator, and academic leader working at the intersections of critical management studies and the humanities. His work explores how organizations are shaped by the ethical, political, and sensory conditions of contemporary life. Trained originally as a classical musician, he brings an embodied and affective sensibility to organizational inquiry using sound, silence, and listening as ways of unsettling dominant managerial assumptions and tracing the atmospheres through organizational life. Through projects ranging from opera companies to open plan offices, he investigates how practices of listening, rhythm, noise, and refusal open questions of voice authority and inclusion. This work informs his public scholarship, including Organising Songs, which is a Substack series that uses music and the unsounded world as an analytical and political method. Richard currently works as an associate head of school at the Open University Business School, where he is responsible for the taught postgraduate programs. Across his roles, he works to cultivate epistemic plurality, inclusive pedagogy, and organizational spaces capable of engaging with the complexities and contradictions of polycrisis. To say that I'm excited is a significant understatement. I'm really pleased to have with us Richard. I'm going to hand over, as always, to give you the space to do your presentation, Richard, and then I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I've already noted down some questions. So the space is yours.
Well, thank you ever so much. I'll just battle the sharing of my screen.
Yes, please.
Which I hope you can now see.
Yeah, it's all here. All good.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you, Nicole, for that warm welcome. I've just seen one of my lovely collaborators, Florence, slip into the room. So it's nice to have a face and a name that I know here, because I'm very conscious that I'm speaking to a new group of people. And in doing that, it's a bit of a challenge to know how to land things with a set of people with different experiences and expectations, and with languages. So I think that's one of the great sort of like excitements, I guess, but also the challenges of coming into a new space like this. But what I want to do today is explore with you sonic inquiry from broadly within my home field of organisation studies. But I'm trying to approach this now with your help, a researcher's practice lens. And my central proposition is that sound is not only an object we might study, but it's also a way of knowing life, of knowing organizational life, and a way of rethinking method, concept, and writing. So the talk's going to draw on some of my academic, but mostly some of my public writing. And across different projects, I've been really signaling my interest in how sound organizes us. It organizes the sense in which we belong, the authority that folk take up in their lives, and what makes what they do legitimate or illegitimate. So questions about what is hearable, what becomes withheld, what gets misheard, or what is made to count as voice or noise or silence. So I'm going to move from songs to sound to silence and finally to writing. So those sort of 4 key moves to ask what we or our academic fields might become when listening is taken seriously as a research practice. But I think I should begin personally, because this work for me comes from a long history of listening Before I started studying organizations for a living, I knew music. I knew music professionally, rehearsals, voices, rooms, silences, timings, rhythms, timbres. And I knew that moment where something becomes audible because people are listening intently. And I think that experience, although I didn't realize it at first, that experience has really started to shape how I understand organizational life. So when I might say that my work stays with songs, sounds, and silences, I mean that both literally and analytically, because for me, songs are not just examples or quirky illustrations, and sounds and not simply sort of background noise, and silence not is certainly more than absence. But I contest with you that there are ways through which life is felt and structured. And so I suppose that the word that matters for me here is audibility. I'm interested in what becomes hearable when we start to listen, and how power works through listening. There we are. That's kind of like the big build up as to what how I'm sort of conceptualizing sonic inquiry, asking us to treat sound as a serious mode of knowing. And I know that the people in this room, the one thing that we will share is that they would take senses and sensory experiences very, very seriously. And then thinking about how then I speak in my field, about how we can reshape how we study organizations or teach them or write about them. But maybe before I say anything else, I just want us to invite us to listen for a moment. Not for something dramatic or meaningful, but just to notice what is already here with us. The point is not that we have to necessarily identify every sound correctly, but it's enough to notice that we are already in a sonic field. And look, so that before we analyze, interpret, or attempt to classify or explain, something is already gathering our attention. And as something gathers our attention, other things sort of recede and other things come to the fore. Perhaps some things are easier to ignore than others. But this is the idea of sonicity that I have, that sound is more than just an object to capture, but a surrounding condition through which attention and relation and meaning begin to form. So we might just listen again. I'm immediately very conscious of the sound of the rain, which is beating on the window outside my room. I wonder what what is sort of like framing the sonic context in which you're sat joining this session. And I suppose what I hope this tiny little exercise makes available to us is that reminder that listening is also never neutral, that it is selective and situated and trained. And because of that, that we have tools which can allow us to question it or to widen or reorient it. That brief moment of listening probably did not produce a single clear object for you. You may have noticed some sounds immediately. Some may have appeared and disappeared. Some may have been harder to name. Some may have felt too ordinary just to notice at all. And I think that's useful because listening often begins before meaning has settled. And so Jean-Luc Nancy is helpful in this regard. Nancy helps me stay with listening as resonance, the moment before meaning is fully settled. But I also I think we should also be careful not to make listening just sound innocent or purely receptive mode. Listening does not begin until after meaning has been clarified. And so is part of how meaning starts to form. Nina Sun-Eidschein, who writes in sound studies, reminds us that listening is a political act. We do not simply hear sounds, voices as they are, but we hear them through our own habits and our histories, our classifications and cultural expectations. Voices are made meaningful through listening practices. So I don't want to if I was talking to an organisation studies crowd, they would expect an awful lot of theory, but I'm going to hold it there with my sort of this theoretical framing for today. If Nancy helps me think about listening on the edge of meaning, iChime helps me ask what happens at that edge of meaning. Who is heard, who is recognized, what assumptions are at that edge, what kind of bodies or identities are attached to that sound. And that captures the move towards audibility, not just about attending to sound, but asking how listening organizes us. So the first element that I bring forward here is the idea of songs, and that became, as my thinking around this has started to evolve, became my first methodological move to stop treating songs as illustration of organizational ideas that might be quirky enough to engage a student, but to think of them as sites of inquiry in their own right. And they form they're quite a bounded piece of sound, sort of collection, entanglement of sound. Songs, you can play them over and over again and sit with them, and you can write from them, notice how they move, how they get loud or soft, the different timbres, the voices, because the song is always more than its lyrics. Voice and rhythm, texture, repetition, memory, idea of the different genres or the atmosphere, conversations about the history of the song or how it was received. That makes songs methodologically useful. They allow us to study meaning while meaning is still forming, as an affective and a relational event. And much better than we can, I think, a song can hold contradiction without feeling the need to resolve it. And it can carry anger and grief or irony or desire before any of those become sort of tidy analytical categories on a page. So when I say that songs know more than us, I mean they organize feeling and attention in ways that matter. They give us a window on power and identity or work, belonging, long before that we can put words around that form. And so it was in that spirit that I started my work on organising songs, treating pop music largely as a site where organisational life can be heard and not just represented. And here is I'll attempt to make this a bit more concrete. Here are some songs that I found useful as analytic openings, certainly not using them to illustrate organization theory, but sonic forms that make certain questions audible. Now, what does this song let me hear that another method might miss? So the example I put here are just two pieces I wrote on Bad Bunny and his Spanish language Super Bowl performance, which attracted quite a lot of attention. I guess you may well have seen it in the press. And what interested me was that originally it was not just that Bad Bunny performed in Spanish, or that some people with some obvious people included in that, some people objected, but that the performance made language audible as an organizing force. But recognizing that English typically sits quietly as the default linguistic infrastructure of public life, all of a sudden Spanish was on that stage and it became marked as an infrastructure, heard and contested. And it seemed quite popular way to be thinking about these things. So I wrote a short case study for the Financial Times, not my typical outlet, but it was useful because it showed how the politics didn't sit in just in the lyrics or even in any explicit message that was being given through the songs that Bad Bunny was performing, but it sat in it was the fact that the conditions in which it was performed had made it audible to a greater public. Spanish started to occupy a ritualized stage of US national culture, English operating as the unmarked infrastructure of belonging. Sound then became troubling because it made a different public audible. And had I had greater confidence in the technology, I might have played one of my guilty pleasure songs, which is "Video Killed the Radio Star." But I'm not going to play it because, in part, I suspect many of you can already hear it in your sort of sounded memories. Released in 1979 at the edge of a media shift, and I wrote about this thinking about how it was looking back to radio as an intimate sonic world, a voice coming through the wireless, heard in the dark, both close and distant at the same time. And then all of a sudden video arrives. And it wasn't that the voice in the song disappears, but it becomes reorganized. It is now attached to moving images, to performance, to production, to greater sort of modalities of replay. So at the time, the song could be heard as a sort of nostalgic account of technological change. But its resonance now feels arguably sharper as we're surrounded by technologies that change the condition of audibility in the same way that Bad Bunny on stage all of a sudden became audible because of this huge spectacle and mass media attention. Maybe we see voices recorded, edited, streamed, presence being produced and synthesized um, I guess in our lecturing work. Often to be heard means becoming content in some form. To have a voice means being rated for voice and ranked and becoming visible and subjected to all sorts of measurement. So the song to me now sounds, and one of the things I was trying to use the song to do was to explain how it feels much less like a quaint story of radio and video, but an earlier diagnosis of what happens when organizational life is mediated by new technologies. And I hope that gives a sense of why I use songs methodologically, familiar enough to be shareable, but open to questions that remain deeply contemporary. Moving away from songs to sounds. The more I stayed with songs, the more wider questions seem to be presented to me. What if the organizations that I think about and teach about and work with, what if they're not just things that we see or read or manage, but something that we hear? What about our life is acoustically constituted? And that's as kind of almost like a secondary methodological shift, moving sonic inquiry beyond sort of like songs as artifacts, but towards sound as part of the material and relational life of organizations, groups, communities, societies, whatever sort of level that you're working at. And that started making me appreciate that meaning doesn't just sit in the text, but this moves through bodies, through how we breathe, through the accents we have in our voice, through the confidence that we might project. It also moves through atmospheres, how the meeting might feel, the pressure of silence, or the buzz of like collective attention. Also, it moves through the infrastructures that we're using now, our computers, our microphones, our Teams calls, those built environments too that carry or constrain sound. So just another way in which sound enables organization itself to become more audible. And gone too far. There we are. And once we move from, we can move towards that statement or that understanding that it is sound that organizes organizational life, shaping attention, shaping the things we notice and what cuts through, what fades away, the raised voice, the silence after a question. It shapes the pace at which people are expected to do things. Organizations have rhythms, meetings drag on and on. Sort of like technology demands immediacy, but it also shapes whose voice belongs in the room, whose tone of voice is read as confident or difficult, and it shapes who can interrupt, what sort of voices or sounds are permitted to break silence, and what would be treated as disruption. So when I say organizations, I've come to see organizations as being acoustically constituted. I mean, that sound is not an afterthought, but it's part of how organizational relations are made. And that sound helps produce the organization as something that people inhabit, and ultimately sometimes resist. So I was thinking then about what's a really, really strong way to give you a sense of the kind of way in which I recognize sound as structuring life. And here we are, the trumpet. I tried to pick something that I guess you would be familiar with. And the trumpet call, or if we think about the family of trumpets, bugles, horns, things like that. An example of sounds that matter because they show how sound organizes us before it explains what it's doing. So if we think historically, trumpet and bugle calls have organized military life. They have told infantry and troops when to wake up, when to march, when to advance, when to retreat, when to come to eat. They've a sound that coordinates bodies across space, that turns sound into action, that makes commands audible without recourse to language. Relatedly, that same sound organizes peace and remembrance. If you think of the last post, which gathers people to silence, it gives grief and national memory a sonic form. It tells us what to remember, but also how to stand, how to wait, how long a minute lasts, how to be still together. I'm thinking of songs and of poems and of books now that I've read, which feature the post horn, another version of this, the post horn that was sounded when the mail arrived, making communication audible across roads and towns and groups of people. Long before we'd receive a text message notification of a delivery, the movement was already being sounded by post horns. So there's this one family of sounds which is organizing violence at the same time as communication, and mourning and attention and civic routine. Being attentive to sort of like sound and that sonic inquiry helps us notice these things, not recognizing sound as being expressive, but a way that actively coordinates bodies and atmospheres and expectations. So moving now to the third of the elements that make up my organizing songs, sounds, and silences project. And silence sort of came into that trio because I came to realize how silence is more than just the absence of speech or sound, but it is something that is actively produced. And it might signal care or hesitation or exclusion or withdrawal. There are lots of ways in which we can come to know and understand silence, but this is actively produced. For people who are like me, who spend time thinking about work and organization, that matters when we talk about employee engagement, when we talk about how we engage with voice, and we assume that the answer is always more speech. Speak up, be heard, participate. But I think that silence is a great example of how it complicates that basic assumption that more speech is a good thing, is the right thing. Silence can be protective and tactical. It might be imposed also or demanded. So that opens up questions of like who really has voice here, and what are the conditions of listening that make people's voices possible? And so I try to write about this in different ways, and the first was through the work of the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, who recently celebrated a big momentous birthday. So I was thinking a lot about and listening a lot to his music. I've always been interested in how his music organizes silence. Very little happens in his music. Now, if you are, I always used to think as a performer performing his music that you were paid more per note in his music than almost anyone else. It organizes silence. Very little happens. Everything depends on spacing, waiting, restraint. And so that way the silence isn't a lack, it's not emptiness, but it allows space for meaning to gather, to give listening room to happen. And I think that in that respect, I could at some point go on to argue how generative silence can be. But I also see that silence has a coercive and political form too. And so I'd been asked to do a broadcast piece around some award shows. And I was thinking about what happens in these. I think it was the Brits or the BAFTAs. I lost track of. I'd read, but I was thinking of award shows where all of a sudden a celeb on stage gets their microphone cut, or the broadcast delay that takes something offline when something becomes a bit too risky to be seen, the sudden change of camera angle, those technical devices through which institutions make decisions about when speech stops being appropriate and silence is preferred. Then again, more evidence of the organization of audibility, deciding who gets to speak. And that's why silence matters too for sonic inquiry, listening to things that are not there, and questioning why they are not. To try to draw this all to a bit of a conclusion, recognize that I make that move from voice to silence to writing. And it'd be interesting to hear about your experiences of writing as well, particularly in the context of a community that is not obsessed with the kind of text-driven outputs that many of my colleagues would be. I don't see writing as separate from listening. I see writing as what follows when listening becomes a method. And since some arguing that sonic inquiry requires us to stay with fragments and atmospheres and traces and partiality, then the way I write needs to find forms that can hold those things without closing in on them too quickly. I've been learning from colleagues around like feminist and critical and experimental approaches to writing, so that writing becomes a part of how knowing happens, and that can hold that hesitation and interruption and multiplicity. I'm working through this with a current paper around the German vocal classification system FAC, which classifies operatic voices by range and timbre and vocal weight and stamina, as well as by gender. And what interests me is not only the system of categories, but how that classification emerges as a trained mode of listening. And the opening claim I make in that paper is that before voices are heard, they are already sorted. Voices become heard through anticipatory categories that shape what can be count as legitimate or promising or excessive. So if we're going to embrace writing in this way, have to do more than simply describe classification, but to make that classification audible as a practice, how it listens, how it sorts, how it anticipates, how it narrows what voice and sound is able to become. And that sort of concludes where I'm going to get to for today. I think that writing doesn't become an illustration after we've done this theoretical work, but that is sort of entangled with the method. Sound is one of these. Sound is going to resist clean representation, so our writing has to respond. And so I've moved us through from songs as bounded sonic forms to sound as part of like the acoustic constitution of organization, to thinking of silence as being politically produced, and then finally trying to draw a link between writing and listening as a shared practice. But my broader claim is that organizations are not simply seen, written, measured, narrated. They're heard and felt. We attune to them, to their silences, to the things that they amplify. And sonic inquiry gives us a way to study that acoustic texture, to think about how power is organized through what becomes audible, what is dismissed as noise, and what is held in silence. So I suppose my last words are to surface the unspoken question that has sort of run through my thinking here, is that what becomes audible when we listen otherwise? That I'm gonna take a sip of my cold tea now, Nicole, and
Thank you so much, Richard. It was absolutely exciting. I knew it was going to be, but you get a lot of love from the room as well. There's a lot of virtual applause, love hearts, celebration. There's a lot going on here, and it was exciting. I do have a couple of questions in the chat box. So I'm going to raise them with you, or
sure.
rather bring the people in. I'm going to also ask everybody else to, who hasn't said anything yet, if you want to ask a question, please let me know. But I'm going to take the advantage of being the host in kicking off the conversation with a very personal question. I've got a view that I've sort of put down. So depending on how the conversation goes, I may bring in some other of my questions as well. But I'd like to start really, because this is the Practices Research Network. I would like to know how you go through the world. Does that mean that you're generally like constantly listening in, constantly attuned to sound? How do you, and then also how do you account for that? How do you, because obviously, I mean, the world is never silent, and like you've just said, even silence is meaningful. So what do you do with all these sounds that you experience on an everyday basis? How do you record them?
Well, it's overwhelming, really, isn't it, to be surrounded by all this possible information, and thinking then about how. So I'm thinking about what we think. I think firstly to recognise my own selective attention, and to recognise that there are times when I am very much in an engaged mode of listening, and that there are other times when simply to get through the day I am choosing not to listen. So I think like to give some form to that practice, to and for a researcher that who is engaged in a a field of rich data and information and possibility. Finding some way to, that was very difficult to put everything that I wanted to say into a short period of time, and we all struggle with that. So to have to make some choices about for me, it'd be that the political and the ethical project that this revealed for me as well. People would take up listening to reveal all sorts of things, but I'm particularly interested in that silencing aspect, in what it make in how we create healthier organizational spaces for people. So that structures my attention a little bit, but I'm going to stop now. I'm going to stop rambling in questions. Yeah, to recognise that I have a political project at work here, and that sometimes I don't listen.
Thank you, thank you. I like that. Sometimes I don't listen. I think we all need to do that. Sometimes not to listen. Josie, can I bring you in, please? You've had a really interesting comment in the chat box earlier, so I'm going to bring you in now.
Hi, Richard. Hello, everybody. I'm in Dubai, and I am really interested in. I'm going to have to look you up a little bit more. I'm doing a doctorate at the moment, and my area of work is communication, particularly under pressure. And when I'm working with people on more effective communication, I often talk about the power of the pause. And when I was doing some research, I stumbled upon Japanese ma, and the idea that in Western society, silence, pause is, or space, unused space, is often seen as negative, but in the Eastern side of the world, it's seen as a positive. So, the paintings where it's a branch and the space on the, around this lonely branch is just as important. And it's reflected in their architecture and in their food. And I often also, and I'm not a musician, but I do use jazz to talk about pause when I'm teaching. So I'd love to know what your thoughts are on that.
As a musician, I always found them. I would always say that the most important parts of the piece were the silences, in that they frame they're so much more powerful than notes themselves, because they frame the start and the end. They frame the journey in the middle. So absolutely, like, fascinated by that silence, and then how that would show up in daily life. And you think of when things happen to us, and we are just struck by sudden silence. It really marks something significant that is happening. And then what then comes of that? What then comes of our response to that? And I'm thinking of the work by one of my friends, Inga Arben, who talks about moments of introverting and seeking out times or teams of times of silence in which, the practice of introverting can be engaged with, and that might be a short time or a long time. But I wouldn't be surprised at all. I have no empirical basis. This is anecdotal, which is not really allowed in my field. So I can say it here safely, because Florence would split on me. But I expect that there are lots of people who seek out silent times, a lot more than we'd realize. And the reason that I started thinking about this was I was thinking of the sort of really the landmark organizational ethnographies in factories, and the factory work was never the factory work never really accounted for the sonic environment and the overwhelming intensity of banging and crashing of machines. And I wanted to find a way in which that we could capture that with people now. So I'd love to learn more about your work, Josie. Let's connect.
I'll be in touch, don't you worry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can I just say, Richard, I know that you're saying you've got no evidence base for people seeking out silence. I have got the evidence base, especially people with neurodivergence.
Okay.
I have got sensory processing disorders. You know, they often find sound quite overwhelming and overpowering, and they actively seek out. So you can say that quite confidently without worrying about it too much. I have got somebody else here who I would like to bring in onto this conversation. I'm hoping that I'm not going to butcher your name, but we have got Majed Zaka here, who's just published a book on enhanced interviews, creative approaches to qualitative research interviewing. So I'm just going to plug this book for him as well. It's within the Creative Research Methods in Practice series, edited by Helen Para. But Margaret, handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Richard, that was beautiful. You made me love the idea of sound. I know this sounds crazy, but I loved how you described this. My question is about capturing a research around sound in writing. Do you think this can be limiting to you being a musician to sort of box the elusive, free, open for interpretation nature of sound into neat writing with perhaps with very limited opportunities for silence? I know it would sound really, it would look really weird to have a couple of pages with no writing. That's probably a print shop error rather than design silence. And my other part of the question is, we know that we hear sounds differently based on where we're coming from. So animals, for example, sound different in different cultures. So in Arabic-speaking cultures, a dog sounds like how, not ruff, ruff, not woof, woof. So how do you square this one when you describe sound of an organization where people may hear productivity and you hear disorganized noise, or when people hear collaboration and you hear too many distractions?
Yeah, I'll give you a response. First of all, on your point of, I think the point you were just making around hearing with the participants, and thinking of some recent use I've been making of participatory sound walks. So walking through research settings with people, asking them to sensitize me to the things that they are hearing as well. Because we come to spaces with different ears, and different attentions, and there will be be attentive to multiple layers of and intersections as to why we bring different ears to those spaces. Is a really nice example that you gave of how animals sound different in different languages. I'm mindful of how every time I land in Paris, the police and ambulance sirens sound very different. The beeps on the I can come away humming the new sounds that the trains make. That we should be, in the same way that writing is stabilizing a meaning and understanding. We need to find ways to combat that, which leaves openness to the reader to engage with it. Otherwise, it is just a very a two-dimensional account. Within my field, there's a really wonderful body of scholarship emerging around writing differently, where folk do leave lines and lines and lines blank and do cool things like align text on the right hand side of the page, or write two columns of text simultaneously to be read across. The piece I've just published with Florence integrates listening links into the text, and we ask people to listen to music as they read. So there are lots of different ways in which that we might try to intervene in that very formulaic way of writing. I think the last thing I'll say is that my frustration with writing for academic publications led to me trying to do much more public writing as a way of trying to explore how I work with words and to learn about that process for myself through doing.
Thank you, Richard. And I agree with what you're saying. The space is becoming more interesting, with people writing poetry or fiction pieces as part of the research process, where it then gets fictionalized in some way, or literary piece. And yeah, absolutely, I agree with you. I've got Benoit André here who would like to ask you a question, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
All good. Hi, Benoit.
Hello. Thank you for your slides. It's super interesting. It's something I've been thinking about for quite a while. So I'm doing a PhD in sound. I don't call it music, I call it sound. I also was a classical singer, so I've sung a lot of Pet as well.
Okay.
But I was a classical musician. I went to uni to do music, and I ended up going into a academic field, kind of called electroacoustic composition. And I don't know if you've been down the rabbit hole of that, but that's now what I'm doing as my PhD. And what I find in electroacoustic, which is really helpful, and will lead me to my question in a second, is that there's a lot of kind of typologies of sound. So there's lots of different academics who have, in their own ways, tried to find different ways to define all the different sounds that are out there. And especially in the 70s, it all came out of a group of people in Canada who were just trying to make sense of all the sounds that are in the city all the time, very invasive. And there was this dude called Stephen Feld. You may have heard of him as well. And he coined this term acoustomology, which is understanding the world around us through all the sounds. And that's what I'm really interested in. So my specific research is looking at if people who live by the river, if we can find out more about the river by working out what they listen to, how they listen to it, etc. So understanding the world through sound, which leads me on to my question, which my first question, I suppose, was, have you been using any specific typologies? Have you been using any frameworks for classifying all the sounds that you listen to, so that you can then say this group of sounds inspires this, or this group of sounds tend to lead to this? So you're talking about different types of silence. You could have different types of silences, I suppose, or different, how you're talking about the bugle horn that goes in a certain category. And then the final thing I would say, which was just to reply to Majid a bit, was I've really gone away from writing, in the sense that if we're listening all the time, why don't we publish sound instead of writing? There are a couple of journals in the electroacoustic world, they don't write at all. So my first and only publication, which will be coming out next year, is just sound. I'm not having to write anything for it. And I think for me, that feels like a really true answer to how to get around the writing issue, is if we're listening, why not present our research as sound instead?
Very interesting.
So my two questions, I suppose, were the typologies and why not? And should we be publishing in sound instead?
Okay, first of all, I haven't been working with typologies. I broadly consider my role in life to break down classifications and to deconstruct them, for various reasons. But so no, I haven't. My undergraduate and my master's degrees were my first ones were in music. So I was trained as a and then at postgraduate performance training. But no, not working with types of sound, typologies of sound. Should we just, I would love to understand better how I can survive in a business school whilst publishing sounds and pictures, and like at some point that I do a deal with the devil to have a relatively stable job in a part of the university not yet savaged by cuts. And one of that is that I try to express myself through the written word. But I'm all for like pushing at the margins there to see what other modalities of expression are possible. I had an unfinished paper which really challenges the text dominance and ocular centrism of academia. Yeah, very interested to follow your work too. So it's been good to stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of comments from two different people that I would like to bring in. I'm quite aware of the time, so I'm going to ask you to just keep your comments short. I'm really sorry that I have to do that. Suzanne.
Hi, yeah, it is really a comment rather than a question, although if you want to respond, I'd happily hear. Very interesting. So I work a lot with creative methods, collage, and kind of crafts-based approaches, and I've asked participants to bring an artifact with them to a research interview. And then in my non-professional life, I listen to a podcast where the podcast host invites the podcast guest to bring a sound clip with them as an open for the podcast. And all I'm doing now in this session is I'm so inspired to try that out, to merge the two approaches. So the artifact becomes like a sound artifact as a stimulus for a research interview. So thank you for kind of stimulating that in me. And that's what I wanted to share, really.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you. Melanie, do you want to come in?
Hello, thank you, Richard. That was really fantastic. I was just curious to know whether you'd engaged much with the work of Sara Ahmed and her feminist ears in kind of institutional listening at all. It's a bit of the spectrum of listening that I'm really fascinated with myself, about this particular framing of feminist listening to structures of power.
Yes, I do draw on Sara Ahmed a little, not so much around institutional listening, but on some of her other work, and more broadly I'm a follower of her work. But yeah, it'd be great at some point to have a conversation about her with you.
I would be delighted. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. I'm really sorry that I'm going to have to cut this conversation short. Clearly, we would have way more time to talk about more of this. I'm just going to say thank you so much for being so generous with your time, Richard, for being here today. It's been a great pleasure. It's been lovely to hear about everything sound. I do hope that we can keep that conversation open between all of us, because clearly sound is something that we're all interested in, but we're not necessarily comfortable or confident in dealing with. So having that kind of community will be quite useful. For the sake of completeness, I am going to share very quickly, if I can. It happens that that there we go. Very quickly, the sort of the links to the recordings of the YouTube channel, to the audio host on the Buzzsprout, and the Practice as Research network webpage. So do have a look at these things. This is also how you can catch me and get in touch with me for any further details and anything that you may want to find out more about. So again, thank you so much, Richard, and I look forward to more of this.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to join you. Thanks.